He pulled out his phone and sent a quick message to his wife. Asterisk landed safely. Can't wait to see you, asterisk. He debated telling her about everything that had happened, but decided to save it for later. It was a story best told in person. Mia walked a few steps behind, still processing everything. She had always known that moments of injustice happened, but today she had seen firsthand how easily someone could be singled out for no reason other than prejudice. She also knew she had a choice. She could ignore it, or she could make sure it never happened on a flight she worked again. As she reached the crew exit, the supervisor caught up to her. "You handled yourself well back there," he said. "We need more people like you on these flights." Mia smiled but then hesitated. What's going to happen to Rebecca? The supervisor sighed. There were already complaints against her. This incident just sealed it. HR will handle the rest, but let's just say she won't be working on another flight anytime soon. Mia nodded, feeling a mix of relief and sadness. As much as she disagreed with Rebecca's actions, she knew that losing a job wasn't easy. But at the same time, accountability mattered. No passenger should have to go through what Marcus had endured. Meanwhile, Eric strolled past a coffee shop, still scrolling through his phone. He had posted about the incident, nothing extreme, just a brief recap of how a passenger had been mistreated and how karma had played out. The comments were already rolling in. Some people shared similar experiences, while others applauded how things had turned out. He grinned, shaking his head. "The internet loves a good justice story," he muttered. Outside the terminal, Marcus took in the crisp evening air. A taxi pulled up, and as he climbed in, he took one last look at the airport behind him. He had entered this journey expecting a quiet flight, but life had thrown him something else entirely. As the car pulled away, he leaned back, finally allowing himself to relax. No anger, no frustration, just the quiet satisfaction of knowing that, for once, the right thing had happened without him having to fight for it. And that, he thought, was a rare thing indeed. Marcus exhaled slowly, gripping the armrest. He had been on enough flights to know that an unscheduled landing was rarely good news. But as he glanced toward Rebecca, whose face had lost all its color, he realized something. Whatever was happening now was about to change everything. The tension in the cabin thickened as the captain's voice faded from the intercom. Passengers exchanged worried glances, their whispers blending into a low hum of concern. Flight attendants moved quickly, reassuring people while trying to find out more details. But Rebecca, she stood frozen, her mind racing. An unscheduled landing. What did that mean for her? Marcus stayed calm, though his grip on the armrest tightened. He had flown enough to know that these things didn't just happen without reason. And judging by the way Rebecca looked like she'd seen a ghost, he had a feeling this wasn't just about a technical issue. The supervisor, now fully in control of the situation, pulled Rebecca aside near the galley. "We'll deal with this when we land," he said, his voice low but firm. "But let me be clear. What I witnessed back there was unacceptable. There have been past complaints, and now this. Consider this your final warning." Rebecca swallowed hard, nodding stiffly. Her career was now hanging by a thread, and she knew it. Meanwhile, Eric tapped away at his phone, refreshing the flight tracker. His eyes widened when he saw the new destination. "We're landing at a major airport, not a random emergency strip," he murmured. He turned to the passenger next to him. "That means there's something more going on." Minutes later, the plane began its descent. The usual smooth approach felt different this time, more deliberate. When the wheels finally touched the runway, a collective sigh of relief rippled through the cabin. But that relief quickly turned to confusion as passengers noticed flashing lights outside. Several uniformed airport officials stood near the gate, waiting. Rebecca's breathing became shallow. She tried to convince herself that this had nothing to do with her, that it was just a routine safety measure. But then, as the plane taxied to a stop, one of the uniformed officers stepped inside and spoke quietly to the supervisor. The supervisor turned, his eyes locking onto Rebecca. "You need to come with us." Her stomach dropped. What? Why? The officer's face remained unreadable. There's an ongoing investigation. We need to ask you some questions. Passengers watched in stunned silence as Rebecca was escorted off the plane. Some exchanged knowing looks, while others whispered theories. But Marcus, he simply exhaled, as if the weight of the entire situation had finally lifted. He hadn't needed to fight or argue. Karma had done all the work for him. As the remaining passengers began to disembark, Mia walked up to Marcus. I just wanted to say, I saw everything, and I'm really sorry for how you were treated. Marcus gave her a small, grateful smile. It's not the first time, but I appreciate you saying that. Just as he stood to grab his bag, Eric passed by, stopping for a brief moment. Hey man, he said with a smirk, I did some digging. Turns out Rebecca had a long history of mistreating passengers. Looks like today was the day it finally caught up to her. Marcus chuckled softly. Karma never loses an address. As he stepped off the plane and into the bright terminal, he let out a deep breath. He had boarded this flight expecting just another trip home. But instead, he had witnessed something rare, justice, delivered in the most unexpected way. As Marcus walked through the terminal, he glanced around at the other passengers dispersing into the crowd. Some were still murmuring about what had just happened on the flight, while others hurried off to their next connections. For him, though, this wasn't just another flight. It was a reminder, one he had experienced before, but this time the outcome had been different. Eric, still seated in economy, leaned forward, fully invested in the scene. He had been debating whether to say something about Rebecca's past complaints, but now it seemed the moment had arrived on its own. Rebecca's face turned red as she struggled to regain control of the situation. Sir, please let me. The executive raised a hand, cutting her off. I don't want to hear excuses. I saw how you spoke to that gentleman earlier, he said, nodding toward Marcus. I saw the way you dismissed him. And now you spill drinks on passengers. Is this really the level of professionalism this airline allows? Mia stepped forward, her voice calm but firm. Sir, I truly apologize for the inconvenience. I will personally assist you with anything you need, and I assure you, your complaint will be addressed. She shot a glance at Rebecca, who looked like she wanted to disappear. Passengers whispered among themselves now, some nodding in agreement. It was clear that Rebecca had drawn attention for all the wrong reasons. Even a few members of the flight crew exchanged uneasy glances. Rebecca's fingers clenched into fists at her sides. She had always been in control, always been the one calling the shots. But now the balance was shifting. And the worst part, she could feel it slipping even further. Meanwhile, Marcus sat back in his seat, watching everything unfold. He had stayed quiet through the disrespect, through the assumptions, through the dismissiveness. But Karma, it seemed, had stepped in, and something told him the real reckoning hadn't even started yet. Rebecca's face burned as the weight of the moment settled over her. The executive's words hung in the air, and the murmurs around the cabin only made it worse. She had always prided herself on keeping control, but now she was the one under scrutiny. For the first time, she felt exposed. Mia, still standing beside her, could sense it too. The entire energy of the flight had shifted. Passengers weren't just watching anymore, they were judging. And Rebecca knew that if she didn't regain control fast, this could get much worse. Just as she opened her mouth to speak, another voice cut through the tension. Excuse me, is there a problem here? A tall man in a dark navy suit had stepped into the aisle. His badge glinted under the cabin lights, an airline supervisor. But what made Rebecca's stomach drop was the fact that he wasn't just any supervisor. He was one of the highest-ranking in-flight managers responsible for handling serious passenger complaints. And now his sharp gaze was locked onto her. Mia immediately straightened. There was an issue with a spilled drink, sir, she said carefully, not wanting to escalate things further. The supervisor turned toward the executive, who was still dabbing at his suit with napkins. Sir, I sincerely apologize for this. I assure you this matter will be addressed properly." Then, without missing a beat, he turned toward Marcus. "And I understand there may have been a concern regarding your seating." Marcus hesitated. He had never been one to stir trouble, but he also wasn't going to ignore what had happened. "There was some confusion earlier," he said, keeping his tone measured. "I had a confirmed upgrade, but I was told to move." The supervisor's face remained unreadable, but there was a certain sharpness in his expression now. He turned back to Rebecca. "Is that correct?" Rebecca swallowed hard. She felt the walls closing in. "There was a misunderstanding," she muttered, but the words didn't hold any weight. Maya resisted the urge to cross her arms. A misunderstanding. That's how she's framing this asterisk. The supervisor nodded slowly, but his next words made Rebecca's stomach twist. "After takeoff, I'd like to have a word with you in the galley." The air around them felt thick. Rebecca forced herself to nod, but inside, she was spiraling. She had been in this job for years. Never once had she been pulled aside by upper management mid-flight. She wasn't just being reprimanded, she was being investigated. Eric, still watching from his seat in economy, felt a strange mix of satisfaction and curiosity. He hadn't even needed to say anything. The situation was unfolding on its own. But just as he thought things couldn't get more interesting, something happened that no one expected. A voice crackled over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We're experiencing an unexpected issue and will need to make an unscheduled landing." The murmurs of the passengers turned into full-on chatter. People exchanged nervous glances, and even the flight attendants looked at one another in confusion. This wasn't part of the plan. Meanwhile, back in his seat, Marcus took a deep breath and tried to shake off the encounter. He wasn't about to let someone's prejudice ruin his flight. He pulled out his phone and sent a quick text to his wife. Asterisk on board. "Can't wait to be home." Asterisk. He didn't mention what had just happened. No need to worry her. But as the plane began boarding its final passengers, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over yet. Something about Rebecca's hostility told him there was more to come. And he was right, because karma was already on its way, and it would strike in a way no one could have expected. As the final boarding call echoed through the cabin, Marcus adjusted in his seat, trying to push the earlier incident out of his mind. The flight attendants moved through the aisles, checking seat belts and overhead bins. From the corner of his eye, he noticed Rebecca still shooting occasional glances his way, her expression unreadable. Mia, on the other hand, kept an eye on her colleague. She had always known Rebecca to be a little sharp with passengers, but this time felt different. There was an edge to her that Mia couldn't ignore. She had seen unfair treatment before, she knew what it looked like. And something told her that Rebecca wasn't done yet. As the plane taxied to the runway, Marcus reached for the small bottle of water by his seat, only to realize it wasn't there. He glanced at the other passengers in business class. Each of them had been given one. Maybe it was a simple mistake, maybe not. When Mia passed by, he caught her attention. "Excuse me, I think I missed a water bottle." Mia blinked, surprised. "You should have received one. Let me check." She walked to the front, scanning the tray where the bottles were stored. Her eyes narrowed. There was still plenty left. Had Rebecca deliberately skipped him? Without a word, Mia grabbed a bottle and brought it back. "Here you go," she said with a small smile. Marcus thanked her, but Mia's mind was still turning. She made a mental note to watch Rebecca more closely. Meanwhile, a few rows back in economy, a young man in his 20s named Eric sat with his headphones on, scrolling through his phone. He had noticed the way Rebecca had treated Marcus earlier, and it didn't sit right with him. Eric wasn't one to interfere, but he believed in standing up when something felt wrong. Curious, he tapped on the in-flight Wi-Fi and did a quick search. A few minutes later, he found something interesting. Rebecca had a history of complaints. He scrolled through a travel forum where passengers had shared experiences about her dismissive attitude, particularly towards certain customers. Some had even filed reports, though nothing seemed to have been done about it. Eric's fingers hovered over his phone. Should he say something, or would it only make things worse? Up in the galley, Rebecca was still fuming, though she masked it well. She had been with this airline for years, and she knew how to handle herself. But something about Marcus got under her skin, and she couldn't explain why. Maybe it was the way he carried himself, like he didn't belong but refused to shrink himself down. As she prepared the first round of drinks, turbulence rocked the plane slightly. She grabbed onto the counter for balance, letting out an annoyed sigh. But as she reached for a tray, her fingers fumbled, and in the next second, something unexpected happened. The drink tray wobbled as Rebecca tried to steady it, but the sudden jolt of turbulence made the glasses slip. In a split second, a full cup of orange juice tipped over, spilling straight onto the uniform of a first-class passenger seated near the aisle. Gasps rippled through the cabin as the man, a well-dressed executive in his 50s, jerked upright, his expensive suit now stained with bright orange liquid, his face twisted in shock before turning into anger. "What is this?" he barked, shaking out his sleeves. Rebecca's mouth opened, but no words came out. She had never made such a careless mistake before. Her hands trembled slightly as she grabbed napkins, trying to clean the mess. I'm so sorry, sir," she stammered. The executive barely looked at her. Instead, he turned toward Mia, who had rushed over at the commotion. "Is this how your airline treats paying customers?" His voice was sharp, demanding attention. Unbelievable. First, I witnessed how this flight attendant mistreated a passenger, and now this. Marcus, who had been watching quietly, suddenly felt every eye shift toward him. His presence in business class had already drawn enough attention, and now it seemed like others were finally realizing what had been happening. The atmosphere inside the airplane buzzed with the usual pre-flight excitement. Passengers settled into their seats, adjusting their bags, flipping through in-flight magazines, and chatting softly. Among them was Marcus, a kind-hearted man in his early 40s, dressed in a sharp navy suit. He had just wrapped up a business conference and was looking forward to getting home to his family. But little did he know, this flight would be anything but ordinary. As Marcus made his way down the narrow aisle, a warm smile on his face, he caught the eye of an air hostess standing near the first-class section. Her name was Rebecca, tall, blonde, and exuding confidence. But the moment her gaze landed on Marcus, something changed. Her polite demeanor stiffened, and a flicker of annoyance crossed her face. At first, he thought nothing of it. Maybe she was just having a long day. Marcus reached his assigned seat, placed his carry-on in the overhead compartment, and sat down, ready to relax. Moments later, Rebecca approached him, her arms crossed tightly over her neatly pressed uniform. "Sir, I believe you're in the wrong seat," she said, her voice cool and clipped. Confused, Marcus glanced at his boarding pass and then at the seat number. "No, I think this is the right one," he replied politely, holding up his ticket. But Rebecca barely looked at it before shaking her head. "This section is reserved," she insisted. "Economy is further back." A few passengers nearby shifted uncomfortably, sensing the tension in her tone. Marcus, remaining calm, tried to explain. "I actually upgraded my ticket to business class. I checked in at the counter and they confirmed it." But Rebecca wasn't having it. Her lips pursed, and she let out a small, exasperated sigh. "Sir, I don't want to argue. If you don't move, I'll have to call security." A hush fell over the surrounding seats. People exchanged glances, unsure of what to say. Marcus felt the heat rise in his chest. He had flown countless times and had never been treated this way. Before he could respond, another flight attendant, a younger woman named Mia, approached. Unlike Rebecca, she had been observing the exchange from a distance, and something didn't sit right with her. "Is there a problem here?" Mia asked, her tone neutral but firm. Rebecca hesitated, her expression momentarily faltering. Marcus turned to Mia, relief washing over him. Apparently, I'm not supposed to be here, even though I have a ticket that says otherwise. Mia took the boarding pass from Marcus and checked the seat number. Her eyes flicked between him and Rebecca, realization dawning in them. Then, just as she opened her mouth to speak, something happened that no one saw coming. Mia looked at Marcus's ticket again, double-checking the details. Her brows furrowed as she turned to Rebecca. "He's in the right seat," she said calmly. Rebecca's jaw tightened. "That can't be right," she muttered, grabbing the ticket from Mia's hand and glancing at it again. But there it was, Marcus's name, printed clearly, with the exact seat number he was sitting in. There was no mistake. The other passengers nearby were now fully tuned in, whispering among themselves. Some looked uncomfortable, while others exchanged knowing glances. It was clear that Rebecca's attitude toward Marcus wasn't about a seating mistake. It was about something else entirely. Marcus exhaled slowly, keeping his composure. "So, can we settle this now?" he asked, his voice even. He wasn't the type to cause a scene, but this situation was starting to feel personal. Rebecca hesitated for a moment before forcing a tight smile. "My apologies, sir," she said, but the words felt hollow. She turned sharply and walked away, her posture stiff. Mia gave Marcus an understanding look before following after Rebecca toward the galley. There was something about the way Rebecca had acted that didn't sit right with her. Mia had worked alongside her long enough to know when she was being difficult with passengers, but this was different. It was almost like she had been trying to make Marcus feel unwelcome on purpose. In the galley, Rebecca leaned against the counter, arms crossed. "What was that all about?" Mia asked, keeping her voice low. Rebecca scoffed. "Nothing. Just handling a situation." "That didn't look like handling a situation. You jumped to conclusions before even checking the ticket." Rebecca rolled her eyes. "Oh, come on, you saw him. He doesn't look like he belongs in business class." Mia's stomach twisted at those words. "What does that even mean?" she asked, her voice sharper now. Rebecca didn't answer. Instead, she turned and busied herself with the drink cart, avoiding Mia's gaze. But Mia wasn't letting this go.